to Convocations, everyone. Today our speaker is Yoram Bowman, who is the world's first and only stand-up economist. He's appeared in Time magazine and on PBS and NPR, and is the co-author of the Cartoon Introduction to Climate Change, the Cartoon Introduction to Calculus, the Cartoon Introduction to Economics, which is now available in more than a dozen languages. He also founded the humor session at the annual meeting of the American Economic Association. He lives in Salt Lake City now and works on economics and climate change policy in Utah, including the Clean the Darn Air, which is a grassroots effort to put a clean air and climate measure on the ballot. Before moving to Utah in 2017, he spent 20 years in Seattle and co-chaired an Initiative 732 effort, which put the first ever carbon tax measure on statewide ballot in the United States. He has a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Reed College and a PhD in economics from University of Washington. His goals in life are to spread joy to the world through economics comedy, and to reform economics education and to implement carbon pricing. The title of Dr. Bowman's presentation today is, Can Utah Be a Pioneer of Bipartisan Climate Action? So let's welcome Yoram Bowman.
Awesome. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with all of you here today. So I do make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics and politics. This is mostly going to be stand-up tragedy as opposed to stand-up comedy, but I understand that there's some time for Q&A at the end, and so if you want some jokes, then that is an opportunity for jokes. And I'll try to keep the conversation light today. So I went with a little bit of a catchier title, perhaps, Gambling on the Climate, but where I want to start where I started. So this is the cover of Newsweek magazine. And if you look at the date up at the top here, this is actually the day I was born. November 19, 1973, there was an oil crisis, like gas prices were really high, there were like lines to get gas, and there were all the concerns about like we're running out of stuff. And I think maybe turn the volume down a little bit. I think maybe the part of the zeitgeist, right, the way people were feeling at the time is captured by this quote from, I have to stay over here, from biologist Paul Ehrlich, who wrote in 1968, he said, "Nothing could be more misleading to our children than our current affluent society." There are all these concerns from the Club of Rome and elsewhere that like we're running out of stuff, right? We're running out of oil, we're running out of minerals, we're running out of food, populations are, growing like crazy. And in contrast to this pessimistic view from Paul Ehrlich, I want to offer up an optimistic view from an economist named Julian Simon from the University of Maryland. Every time I read this quote, I kind of get chills. Here's what he said. He said, "This is my long-run forecast in brief. The material conditions of life will continue to get better for most people in most countries, most of the time, indefinitely. Right? Within a century or two, all nations and most of humanity will be at or above today's Western living standards." So you can see, I think, a pretty strong contrast between the pessimistic view and the optimistic view. And one reason why these two folks are extra famous is that in 1980, they made a bet. And Julian Simon actually offered up this bet. He said, hey, look, you think that we're going to run out of stuff. And if we're going to run out of stuff, then the price of things should go up. Right? But I think there's going to be lots of things, right? People are really going to get better at growing food and digging minerals out of the ground and finding oil and stuff like that. And I think the price of those things is going to go down. So you pick, this is what Julian Simon said, I will let you pick 5 commodities of your choice, and we'll make a bet about what's going to happen to the price of those commodities over the next 10 years. So this is a pretty famous bet called the Simon-Ehrlich bet. They bet $10,000 on the price change between 1980 and 1990 of 5 items that were picked by Ehrlich, okay, picked by the pessimist, and he ended up picking these 5 that you can see on the screen. And so they made the bet in 1980 about what would happen to the price change by 1990. If the prices went up, then Ehrlich won the bet. If the prices went down, then Julian Simon, the optimist, would win the bet, and Simon won the bet. And in fact, if you go back to the quote by Paul Ehrlich, right, nothing could be more misleading to our children than our current affluent society, right? He said this in 1968. So I'm the children that he's talking about, right? And many of you are now like the grandchildren that he was talking about, and life is still pretty good. Okay? So an important lesson here about bets is that bets can change the world. You may know that there's a fair amount of antagonism between like environmentalists and economists, and a lot of it comes back, I think, to the Simon-Ehrlich debate. There's also a lesson here about markets, right, which is that if we're running low on things like copper, then markets send a price signal by driving up the price of copper, and that price signal functions to encourage people to find new sources of copper, to economize, to find alternatives to copper, things like that. So this goes back to Adam Smith's famous metaphor of the invisible hand. Right? Adam Smith, one of the kind of the grandfather of modern economics, who wrote in 1776, a moderately important year in the history of the universe, right? He wrote that people are led as if by an invisible hand to achieve an end that was no part of their intention. Right? So just because you have business people or individuals who are looking for profits or they're looking for the best price for something, right, they end up competing with each other. Businesses will compete with each other, and one way to compete with and win that competition is to provide customers with good products at relatively low prices. Right? And that's the end that Adam Smith says was no part of their intention. Okay, so that's the idea of the invisible hand. And there's a story I like to tell about how, the pessimists say that we're on this bus and we're all passengers on the bus, and the bus is heading towards the edge of a cliff and there's nobody driving the bus, and the pessimists are freaked out about this, right? We're going to run out of everything. We're going to go over the cliff, and the economists are hanging out in the back of the bus and they're smoking cigars and having drinks and having a great time, and the pessimists are like, come on, you guys, there's nobody driving the bus. You should be terrified. And the economists are like, no, don't worry about it. The invisible hand is driving the bus. Boom. Thank you. So, the important lesson about markets, but it's not the whole lesson, right, because of market failure. So there are also cases where markets don't work very well. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner in economics, studied some of these cases that economists call market failure, where markets don't, individual self-interest doesn't end up leading to outcomes that are good for the group as a whole. And his famous quote is that sometimes the invisible hand is invisible because it's not there. And as a fine example of this, right, if we're running low on, say, the atmosphere's ability to safely absorb carbon dioxide, then markets are not going to send a price signal about that. So if you take an economics class, you'll learn about externalities, market failures. Pollution is a classic example of this. Carbon dioxide and global warming is an example of international, sort of global pollution. And so we're not going to get a price signal from markets, and it's a bad idea to try to rely on markets to try to address those sorts of problems, right, by themselves. Okay, so markets aren't going to send a price signal, but policy can send a price signal, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. Since I talked about climate change, let me just give you everything I think you need to know about climate change in just a couple of slides. So first of all, we have this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody doubts that this is happening, or that this is primarily due to human activity, principally burning fossil fuels and deforestation. Then we have this fact that if carbon concentrations in the atmosphere go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden. And in 1896, anybody know what was happening in Utah history in 1896? 1896, Utah became a state, right? In 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would eventually increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is actually still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden, right, at a time when agriculture dominated the economy, right? So the thought of having some higher temperatures seemed pretty good. And these days we tend to be a little more concerned about, rising sea levels, ocean acidification, extreme weather events, floods and droughts, stuff like that. In any case, we have been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. So the blue dots are measures of global average temperatures for individual years from the 1880s up to 2013, 2014, I believe. Okay. And you can interpret this graph, you can read it in different ways, right? I look at this graph and I'm like, yeah, temperatures have been going up, kind of like climate scientists projected. But you could also look at this graph and say, well, for these last few years here, right, this is 1998 right here. Since 1998, you could say there really hasn't been a whole lot of global warming. And this was something that like climate scientists talked about. It was called like the pause or the hiatus or something like this. Right? And right around this time in 2014, there was an article about this in the Economist magazine who pressed the pause button, and an economist who's skeptical about climate change reached out to me on Twitter and said to me, he said, how long must the pause continue before you switch from do something to wait and see? This guy's Brian Kaplan. He's at George Mason University. And so we made a bet. So our bet was whether global temperatures peaked around 2015. The details of the bet is we were going to compare the 15 years up through 2014 to the 15 years after it. So the betting period actually doesn't end until 2030. So we haven't totally resolved the bet yet, but we have a fair amount of data that I'm going to share with you in a minute. The participants were me and two economists at George Mason University. Brian Kaplan was the most important one. He's a big fan of Julian Simon, right, the optimist that I shared with you earlier. In fact, he's such a big fan of Julian Simon that he named one of his children Simon after Julian Simon. He also has he's a big fan of betting. He has a blog called Bet On It, or Substack these days. He reached out to me, so we talked on Twitter, and he asked me for 2-to-1 odds, and I said, oh, I'm so confident that climate science is right, I'm going to give you 3-to-1 odds, which turned out to be stupid, because why would you take 3-to-1 odds when you can get 2-to-1 odds, right? In any case, we ended up betting my $2,000 against their $533. Ended up making a bet with his colleague at, I believe, 5-to-1 odds. And let's take a look at the preliminary results. So here's the first through 2014. This basically these temperature readings here. And if temperatures didn't really go up beyond that, then they would be winning the bet. And if temperatures went up considerably beyond that, then I would be winning the bet. And not to brag or anything, but here's what temperatures have looked like since 2015. All right. I'm totally smoking them. Maybe bad for the planet, okay, but good for the bet, at least for my side of the bet. And I want to show you, I want to put 10-year bars on this. So these are our temperature averages for every decade from the 1880s up to the present time. And what I want to tell you is how incredible climate science is. Because like in this period, like 1990 or 2000, okay, climate scientists, like think about how complicated the whole planet is and the climate of the whole planet, and even doing the calculations of global average temperatures and stuff, right? That's like mind-blowingly difficult stuff. And what climate scientists said in 1990 is they basically said, look, we're going to get, if we continue to emit fossil fuels, we're going to get about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade of global warming. And if you look at what happened, like, wow, 0.2, we're heading towards 0.2. I mean, incredible. To be able to make that prediction and have the prediction come true, I mean, that's what science is all about. Really amazing. So, that's bet number one. I should mention, by the way, that if anybody here is skeptical about the science of global warming, then I'm welcome. I encourage you to make further bets with me about this. I'm happy to make bets with you as long as you've got good credit. Okay? All right, second bet I want to talk about. I'm talking about 3 bets today. Second bet is about whether global fossil fuel emissions are going to peak by 2030. And here we don't have, like, there's not climate science about this. This is about policy and economics and stuff like that. I'm not confident that I'm going to win this bet. I am confident I'm going to win the first bet. So will global fossil fuel emissions peak by 2030? Maybe they will, right? The Economist wrote earlier this year, they said it seems increasingly likely that a peak has finally been reached in terms of global fossil fuel consumption and carbon emissions from fossil fuels, right? And the story here is that, you know, wind and solar, electric vehicles and stuff like this, or batteries are on this unstoppable trajectory, and they're just going to outcompete fossil fuels. Here's a projection from the International Energy Agency, which is like an international group that works on energy stuff. They claimed in 2023, we are on track to see all fossil fuels, so coal, oil, natural gas, the three main fossil fuels, peak before 2030. Their consumption of all of those is going to peak before 2030. Okay. So I have a fair amount of respect for these folks, but I am not convinced. So I fear that the recent pause in emissions growth was really only a pause, and if you look at what global emissions have, these are global fossil fuel emissions, right? You can see there's kind of been a pause over the last 10 years or so, but what I think is driving that pause are things that are mostly going to go away. So like COVID-19 is an example, so you can see this big dip here because of COVID. But if you imagine that COVID had never happened, right, then we would have been on a more of an upward trajectory. I think there have been coal cuts in the rich world. So here's fossil fuel CO2 emissions in the United States. Right, and you can see that the big story in the United States over the past 20 years or so has really been that there's been a sharp decline in the use of coal, even in Utah, right, and a sharp increase, especially in the use of natural gas. And per kilowatt hour of electricity, you get about half of the carbon emissions from natural gas that you get from coal. Okay, so, and this shift has been happening around the rich world, right? Natural gas has been replacing coal, carbon emissions have been falling. The problem is that there's just not that much coal left in the rich world. So once we finish, or once we can no longer make easy progress, like pick the low-hanging fruit by replacing coal with natural gas, then it becomes much harder to cut emissions in the rich world. And as you can see from this chart here, we're pretty close to getting to that point where we've picked the low-hanging fruit. China, I would argue, has had a pause in coal consumption, but I'm not convinced that it's a plateau. I think maybe it'll keep going up again. I mean, this is one of the most incredible charts you're ever going to see, because this is basically like economic growth in China from about 2000, right, when China was a super poor country, to now where they're like a middle-income country. Right, income maybe, I don't know, a tenth of the United States or something like that, right? But you see this incredible growth in the use of coal in China, and there was this plateau here, right, in the mid-2010s, but lately it's been going up again. Pay attention to the y-axis here. So these are 8 gigatons of CO2, and if you can compare that to the United States, right, so 8 gigatons is 8 billion ton, sorry, yes, 8 billion tons. The U.S. is at 3 billion tons. So China, remember, has 4 times as many people as we have, okay? And their coal use is, you know, almost 3 times ours. Or excuse me, this chart here, we're going from 3 gigatons over here in the United States, right, to 8 gigatons on the y-axis in China. So even though China has 4 times as many people as we do, they only have like twice as much CO2 emissions. So if they wanted to use more coal, right, there's plenty of potential opportunity there. If you think about India, so China has about 1 billion, more than 1 billion people. India has about the same population as China, a little bit more, right? You see like exponential growth in coal consumption in India. But again, look at the y-axis. Okay, so coal in India is about 2.5 gigatons. Compare that with China, which is over 8 gigatons. Okay, so India is a lot poorer than China, a lot poorer than China, and could potentially grow, by burning a lot more coal, right, for electricity and things like that. There are also things like demand for electricity from artificial intelligence. I want to share with you, this is an experiment I was thinking of doing in one of the classes that I work on at my kids' elementary school, right? Can you use mirrors to light a candle? Like if you use mirrors to reflect sunlight, can you light a candle? Right, so I asked Google, and in the past it would just like search web pages and stuff, but now it uses artificial intelligence to tell you that, can you light a candle with 5 mirrors? No. Okay, so I said, all right, what about 15 mirrors? Can you light a candle with 15 mirrors? And the artificial intelligence was like, maybe. And then I said, okay, can you light a candle with 100 mirrors? No. No. 15 is like the magic number of mirrors to light a candle. So there is, it takes a lot of electricity to come up with brilliant answers like this. Okay, like 10 times more electricity to get a response from AI than it does just like your normal Google search. And if you look at projections for electricity consumption in the US and arguably around the world, like they're going way up because of data centers and stuff like this. Okay, driven by AI and things like that. Also, I want to mention that optimistic projections that we've reached a peak of fossil fuels have been made before. So here's an article from 2020 that suggests that because of the dip from COVID, we were never going to get that much fossil fuel use ever again. Okay, CO2 emissions from fossil fuels may have peaked in 2019. The author, Zeke Hausfather, very smart guy, climate scientist at Stripe and Breakthrough Institute and things like that. So he and I made a bet. So we bet about whether global fossil fuel emissions for all 3 of the fossil fuels plus the grand total would peak by 2030. Here you can see the trend that they've been on so far, and one thing that's kind of cool about this chart is that it also shows like wind, solar, hydro, nuclear down below. Right? And you can see that solar, for example, has been growing very fast, right? But from a relatively low base, right? Certainly compared to the 3 fossil fuels. And you can also see that the main fossil fuels have all continued to go up. So the participants in bet number 2 are me and Zeke Hausfather, and some other random guy on X decided to join the bet on Zeke's side. We bet $800 total, so $200 each on the 3 kinds of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, and then $200 on total fossil fuels. And we'll wait and see. We have to wait until 2031 or 2032 or whatever to see who wins that bet. Okay, I'm pretty confident that natural gas use is going to continue to go up. Right, that's the blue line. I'm not quite sure about oil, and I'm very not quite sure about coal, but that's the bet that we made. Right, I hope I lose the bet, but at the moment I don't think I'm going to. Nonetheless, there is some good news on the climate front. Right, and the good news is here's where global CO2 emissions have been going, right, and they have been increasing relatively slowly over the past decade or so. Right, there was a time when it looked like we were going to burn lots and lots of coal globally, and it now seems that seems much less likely. Right, the paths that people talk about are sort of in this range. Okay, and the temperature increases that that climate scientists are projecting by 2100 are currently like around the 2.7, 3 degrees Celsius kind of area, whereas before, 10 years ago, folks were talking about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. So there is some good news there. There's also some bad news, though. The bad news is that my perspective on this is that we're still basically drifting. So sometimes we drift in a good direction, right? Renewables become cheaper, electric vehicles, all that sort of stuff, right? Batteries, wind and solar, but sometimes we drift in a bad direction. So interest rates go up, that makes it harder to invest in renewables because you have to, borrowing costs go up if your interest rates are higher. We have increased demand that comes from artificial intelligence, things like that. So we're adrift. And so what do we need to do in order to stop drifting? And I would argue that what we need to do is we need to enact a market-based climate policy that's bipartisan and pocketbook friendly. So climate bet number 3 is, can we enact this kind of climate policy? right? A market-based climate policy that's bipartisan and pocketbook friendly. That's the third bet that I'm making. The stakes here are my life. So I'm spending a considerable portion of my life energy trying to make this happen. Basically why I went to graduate school to study economics, and a fair amount of what I've been doing since then is trying to work on market-based climate policy that's bipartisan and pocketbook friendly. And what I want to try to convince you of in the next 10 minutes is that this kind of policy exists, that it's hard but really important, and that it's possible in Utah. Okay, so to prove that it exists, right, we can send a market-based price signal with a carbon tax. So we talked about price signals a little bit earlier, right? And even though there's externalities and market failure when it comes to pollution, right, governments can internalize those externalities. They can correct the market failure by basically putting in a surrogate for a missing market instrument, a missing market signal, and they can do something like a carbon tax that's going to raise the price of fossil fuels and basically include into the price of fossil fuels the external costs, those other costs associated with ocean acidification, rising sea levels, floods and droughts, that sort of stuff. So we can send a market-based price signal with a carbon tax, and we can make it bipartisan and pocketbook friendly by using the carbon tax revenue to reduce existing taxes. So carbon tax doesn't sound very good to lots of people, but cutting other taxes sounds good to lots of people. And the idea that I work on is to try to balance those things out. So instead of having a tax on income or payroll or savings or consumption, we can have a tax on carbon emissions instead. Okay, so fossil fuels are going to become a bit more expensive, but everything else is going to become a little bit less expensive, and that's what's going to make it pocketbook friendly. And hopefully that's what can make it attractive on a bipartisan basis. So this is called like a revenue neutral carbon tax. Revenue neutral meaning we're not trying to make government bigger or smaller. We're trying to get the same amount of revenue from a different kind of tax. Or you can think about it as a tax swap. I'll give you an example. So I worked on this campaign in Washington State almost 10 years ago now, Initiative 732. It was to balance a carbon tax with a cut in the state sales tax and a couple other smaller taxes for manufacturers and low-income households and things like that. But the lion's share of it was, let's have a carbon tax on fossil fuels, and then let's cut the sales tax on everything else. I was part of a small grassroots group. I was one of the leaders of this group. We gathered 240,000 signatures from voters in Washington State. That was not a small endeavor. We put our policy on the ballot. We qualified for the 2016 ballot. Okay, and I would argue that 732 was market-based and it was pocketbook-friendly, and we even got some bipartisan support. So we had a decent number of Democrats who came out in support of our policy. We also had the fellow who ran for governor as a Republican in 2012. He endorsed our policy. 3 sitting state senators who were Republicans endorsed our policy. So we made some progress there. But we didn't win. So that's an example of how market-based climate policy is hard. So we lost in November 2016, 59% no, 41% yes. This was in Washington State, which is a reasonably blue state. Okay, and my joke after a great deal of therapy about why we lost is that we were opposed by folks on the right who were afraid that our policy was socialism, and we were opposed by folks on the left who were mad that it wasn't. All right, so the right-wing opposition you probably understand pretty well. Right, there are lots of folks out there who are not on board with climate science or carbon taxes or things like that. Right, the opposition from the left is perhaps a little more surprising, but there are plenty of folks on the left who wanted the Green New Deal, or they thought that the way to fight climate change was to start by overthrowing the cisgender capitalist heteropatriarchy, and that's not what our policy was. Our policy was not the Green New Deal. So I should be clear about who on the left opposed our policy. So the Sierra Club came out against our policy. League of Conservation Voters recommended a no vote. Democratic Governor Jay Inslee, often called the greenest governor in the country, he opposed our policy. It got kind of ugly. So politics is hard. I'll give you an update on what's happened since then in Washington State. So in November of 2020, the state legislature ended up under the control of the Democrats. In 2021, they passed a cap and invest bill. That's another way to put a price on carbon. Right? It was market-based, but it wasn't bipartisan. It wasn't pocketbook friendly. I think it's kind of a dead end. So what they did was they put a price on carbon, and then they used the money for things like investing in electrifying the state ferry system and stuff like this. And the New York Times had an article about this, right, where they quoted a woman who's a retired union electrician in the Seattle area who has concerns about climate change and has long supported Democrats. But she was opposed to this cap and invest policy because gas prices went up by 30 to 50 cents a gallon. This was after the governor had promised that gas prices would only go up by pennies. Right? They went up by 30 to 50 cents a gallon. And what she said was, where am I going to get that money? Which I totally agree with. If you have a policy that's not pocketbook friendly, then you're going to run into trouble. I would argue that market-based climate policy that's bipartisan and pocketbook friendly is really important. Right? Market-based is important because we want to send a price signal, right? And we want to use the power of capitalism to reduce emissions. Okay? Whether you love capitalism or hate capitalism, we should all be able to agree that capitalism is a very powerful force in the world. And what I work on as an economist, as an environmental economist, is using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. You can have government policies and subsidies and all that sort of stuff, right? But I think if you really want to change things, then you have to have a price signal to drive change in the market. I think bipartisan is important because neither party is going away. And I think pocketbook friendly is important because even people who care about the end of the world also care about the end of the month. People got to be able to make ends meet. And if that's true in the US, then imagine China or India or Ghana, places that are much poorer than we are. We can't solve climate change without them also reducing emissions. And if it's hard for us to reduce emissions because we don't have the money, think about how hard it is for them to reduce emissions. Right? If you're living on 1/10 of the income that we have here in the US or 1/20 of the income that we have in the US. Finally, I want to argue that these kind of policies are possible in Utah. So I'm part of a group called Clean the Darn Air, right, that's advocating for a clean air and climate policy in Utah. And in a nutshell, what our policy is, right now Utah is one of the few states in this country that has a sales tax on grocery store food. So let's get rid of the sales tax on grocery store food. Let's replace it with a modest carbon tax on fossil fuels that are the main cause of local air pollution and global climate change. If you want the gory details, we're going to eliminate this 1.75% state sales tax on grocery store food. We're going to fund an earned income tax credit match and some other tax changes. And in return, right, the way we're going to pay for all that is with a modest carbon tax that starts at about $12 per ton of CO2, so that's about 10 cents a gallon of gasoline, about a penny a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power. So the question that I want you to think of, right, is would you be willing to trade paying 10 cents a gallon more for gasoline? Would you be willing to trade that for not having to pay sales tax on groceries? And, by the way, doing our part to save the world. Okay? That's what I want you to think about. We also are going to use any money that's left over to improve local air quality and support rural economic development. So we've tried ballot measure efforts before. We may try again in a couple of years to get on the ballot. It is very difficult to get on the ballot in Utah, and every year it seems to be getting more difficult to get on the ballot in Utah. So we have never been able to gather all the signatures that we need. But right now we're doing education and outreach. So if any of you are interested in this campaign or this policy, I hope you'll come and let me know. I've got some stickers up here. We have these cool Clean the Darn Air stickers. I also have some of my own business cards. And if you're interested in any of my cartoon books, I brought some copies for you to check out if you want. And if you're interested in purchasing them, then they're available for like $10 or $20 if you're independently wealthy. I lose money on every copy when I sell them at $10, but I make up for it with volume, just like Amazon.com. Another thing that you can do to help out, is we were kind of thinking like, how can we get more people involved in this campaign? And I wrote a play. How many of you were expecting that? It's called Seize the Initiative. It's a romantic comedy. It's about democracy, climate action, and sandwiches. It premiered this last summer at the Great Salt Lake Fringe Festival, directed by a Snow College theater professor, Josh Patterson. And we're going to be doing a reading of the play here on campus in just a couple of hours. So it's today at 3:30. It's in the Kim K Theater, which I understand is just right across the way here. If you're interested, it's going to be fun. We're going to have, it'll take an hour, and then there'll be like a 20-minute feedback session. If you'd like to come, I think that would be awesome. I guarantee that you'll have a good time. You can also find out more if you want to watch a video instead, which is much less fun. You can get that from my website. So those are the 3 climate bets that I wanted to share with you today and to give you my thoughts on. Did global temperatures peak around 2015? Almost certainly not, although I won't collect my money for a couple more years. Second is whether global fossil fuel emissions are going to peak by 2030. I'm skeptical, but we'll see. And the third one is whether we can enact market-based, bipartisan, pocketbook-friendly climate policy, including in Utah. I hope so. If you're interested in that in any way, shape, or form, I hope that you will connect with me. That's how to get a hold of me. And I am now happy to take some questions. Thank you all very much.
All right. So, yeah, think about questions you want to ask. Like usual, wait until you get a microphone so people on the live stream can hear your questions as well. And also, I want to note that the event today at 3:30, that does, if you are enrolled in the class, counts as one of the cultural events. So please do attend. So we can start with if anybody has questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman, for your wonderful, funny, and frightening presentation today. For starters, I hope you'll keep in touch with us as these move forward towards, ballot initiative signatures and things like that with campus. My question kind of goes back to was that initial Ehrlich and Simons moment that you set us up with in the 70s, and I think of, obviously, like with the Ehrlichs, there were a lot of problems with their work, with the population bomb and things like that. One thing, though, I remember growing up, kind of those of us that came up in the 80s and 90s, if this makes sense, there was almost a perverse hope that the scarcity of things like cheap, easily accessible coal and oil would help kind of externally force us to put the brakes on our consumption of these things and force us to come up with creative transitions to like renewables and cleaner stuff. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have, right, in some of the ways you pointed to, because of our failure to account for externalities, and also just like how we now are raking out more energy intensive and dirtier like tar sands and oil shale, and scraping battery minerals out of Africa and metals and cobalt off the ocean floor and stuff like this.
All right, don't depress me anymore.
But I guess, obviously, you're accounting for these kinds of things in some of these trying to fix some of the market signals to account for and accommodate these things. I guess my question, you can speak to any of that you like, but my question mainly is, so coming out of this recent legislative session in Utah, I was kind of surprised, maybe because I hadn't followed or anticipated this, but one of the sort of abrupt and unsettling things to me is how, at least it looks like, how enthusiastically all in Utah seems to be trying to, or some representatives seem to be trying to go in on like getting in on the, I'm using an MLM word, right? Like the ground level or whatever of AI. We're kind of falling all over ourselves
data
about
centers and stuff,
trying to get in.
All right, I think I understand where you're going with your question.
So what do you, are you frightened by this? How are you responding to this sort of AI in the context of scarcity and water and all these things in our state?
So it would be great if people were better people. Right? Like, it would be great if people didn't want to drive Porsches and eat steak every night and stuff like that. And I do think there's a storyline that's like, well, if we could convince people to like live a little more sustainably and be a little lighter on the earth, then that would help a lot. And that's true, it would help a lot. But where I come from as an economist is I just don't think we're going to get there. I don't think people are that good. Right? I think about my sister-in-law. I love my sister-in-law, but if she had to compost to save the world, then we just wouldn't save the world. Right? Like, she doesn't compost. She's just like, that's not, like, there are, some people out there who will drive electric cars, and then there are a whole bunch of people like my wife who are against them. Right? Like, she just is worried about range anxiety and is not willing to make that trade-off. So I just think that from where I stand, I kind of take people where they are and how they are. And most people are not interested in reducing their consumption in order to save the world. And that's just the facts as I see them. Who's next? Gentleman's next.
What's the most amount of money you spent on a bet?
Sorry, what's that?
What's the most amount of money you spent on a bet?
That I've spent on
What's the most amount of money you spent on a bet?
a bet.
Yes.
Oh, well, I haven't lost any bets yet because these are the only bets I've ever made. I don't bet on football or things like that. So I could potentially lose $2,000 on this bet, but I'm not going to. The trouble is that I was so confident that I was going to win this bet about global temperatures that I was like, okay, I'm going to make another bet with all the money that I'm going to win from this first bet, right? Which I think is like, that's dangerous when you're already betting your winnings that you have made from a bet that hasn't been finished yet. Right? I think that's one of the signs that you should call gambling anonymous or something like that. So they're financially sustainable amounts, especially because I'm going to win. Maybe we can do a show of hands and see. So if we had a policy like this on the ballot, right? I'm just curious to get a sense of how many of you would support a policy like this or oppose a policy like this. There's no right or wrong answers, right? Forget about the fact that I'm devoting my life to this kind of policy, right? So if we had something on the ballot in Utah that was like, hey, let's have a carbon tax, so you'd have to pay 10 cents a gallon more for gasoline, but we're going to cut the state sales tax on grocery store food. We're going to eliminate the state sales tax on grocery store food, and we're going to have a little bit of money for rural economic development and clean air and some stuff like that, right? But mostly it's this revenue neutral tax swap idea, excuse me. Show of hands, no right or wrong answer. How many of you would be inclined to vote yes on something like that? How many of you would be inclined to vote no? All right. We're going to win Snow College. All right. I will tell you that it's hard, right? It's hard, but I also think that it's an incredible privilege to be able to work on things like this and to live in a country that's a democracy where you can speak your mind and try to do stuff like this, right? And even if it doesn't succeed, and I think that that's something that, I don't know, I try to remind everybody that we're all incredibly blessed to be able to spend our time talking about these issues and working on them, and that we live in a country where we're free to do that. America, please join me. Yeah. And then maybe there was a hand over there also, but go ahead, Eric.
Was there another hand? Okay. Okay, I'll ask this quick question. Why do you think it is so hard to get people on board with this? I mean,
I can
for me,
answer that.
it seems to make sense.
Yeah.
And for you, obviously, it seems to make sense. Why is this so hard for most Americans to get on board with?
I mean, tax policy is hard, right? Like, everybody loves stories about how we're getting screwed, right? Like, so the challenge with changing tax policy, and this isn't just carbon tax stuff, this is like, hey, let's get rid of the income tax. Like, Herman Cain had a 999 plan a couple years ago that was like, let's get rid of the income tax and have a national sales tax instead. People hated the idea, right? Because we're sort of caught between like hating the tax system that we have now and being terrified that any changes that we make are just going to make it worse. Right? You see this over and over again, like in healthcare, in tax policy, stuff like this. And I think part of the underlying challenge is there's like this skepticism and cynicism. And it's very difficult to operate in that kind of environment. Like in Washington State with our campaign, we told people, look, our policy is going to cut the state sales tax. Right? And they would just say, oh, I don't believe you. I don't believe you're going to cut the state sales tax. And if you do cut the state sales tax, the legislature is just going to raise it back up again. Right? And so in that kind of environment, it's very difficult to get things to change. The other thing is like we're pushing on something that's very hard. Like for whatever reason, as an economist, I don't understand this. Maybe the psychologists here do. Right? You all understand it intuitively. Like people hate gas price increases. Right? I kind of look at it and I'm like, why would you hate a gas price increase more than an increase in the price of chicken? But people do. Right? People go crazy about gas prices. So that's a very tough nut to crack. There was a hand in the back, maybe?
Yeah, kind of along those lines. It's been interesting to me how gas prices have become such a standard of prosperity or how well the country is doing. It's like they've become the temperature for what's going on in the country. And I wonder how much of it is just because gas prices are on brightly lit marquees all over the place. So it's like gas prices are in your face.
Yeah.
And sales tax isn't, right? It's just kind of, I go buy groceries, I don't think about the sales tax. I don't know, is there a way we can stop advertising gas prices and start advertising, prices of
Advertising egg
food
prices?
just as effectively as gas prices are advertised?
I mean, that is one of the challenges, right, is that gas prices are on those big signs. I will say that, like, egg prices apparently have been going up, and people seem to be upset about that, and, like, you don't see egg prices on the signs or anything, but people get it. Sales taxes are challenging. If you poll people and ask people what the most popular tax is, right, if you had to raise revenue, and we do have to raise revenue to pay for roads and schools and hospitals and stuff like this, right? Like, sales taxes are very popular politically. And I think that's because everybody thinks that everybody pays them. It's also because you're already paying something like at the store, and it's just an additional 6% or 8% or whatever it happens to be. So for whatever reason, sales taxes turn out to be popular, even though as an economist, I can tell you that they're regressive, right? They're harder for low-income households than for higher-income households. I don't think there's a way, like I'm enough of a free market economist that I wouldn't support like passing a law that you can't post the price of gasoline on the gas station, right? But I do think that we can try to make a pitch, right? And the pitch that we're trying to make is, look, yeah, you have to buy gasoline, but you also have to buy food. And we're going to have folks, we're going to all agree that we're going to pay a little more for the gasoline and we're going to pay a little bit less for the food. And that's going to work out for most people's pocketbooks in a way that's going to help us all get incentives to move in the direction of lower carbon emissions that's going to help address climate change. Thanks very much. I'm happy to chat with anybody afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Bowman.
And come to the play reading, please, 3:30 today.